Welcome to the Futures Forum Live online, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. On this edition of the Futures Forum Live, we exchange ideas, information, education, and inspiration about the future of Black America. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Futures Sense now. Share this story and share our future. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to the Futures Forum Live, an online e-zine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and so we're having a conversation on the future history of Black America. Specifically, I'd like to examine how might life be in the year 2030 for people of African descent in these United States. Now, we know that we're talking about America being a majority-minority country, and if you might ask, well, why 2030? Well, UN Sustainable Development Goals are set for 2030, and indeed, one brave soul, Jeffrey Sachs, in fact, has decided to create America 2030 goals. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into a conversation with Dean BRENT CHRITE, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right, who is the 16th Dean of the Daniels College of Business in Denver, Colorado. He has been very actively engaged in academic leadership over the several years and has led a lot of research projects to some of those developing countries around the world. He has done work in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, Central Eastern Europe, and the list goes on. So greetings, Dean CHRITE, and thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the Futures Forum Live.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
As I was saying in my opening lines, that 2030, the UN and countries around the world have talked about working towards 17 Sustainable Development Goals that will hopefully bring humanity forward even more than we have gotten. And this talks about, for instance, SDG 10, inequality, which is a major issue for people of African descent in America. I like to think of Black America as a sort of developing country within the United States. So I'd like to ask you to start off with, first of all, would you agree that Black America is like a developing country in the United States? And two, doing what you do in business, do you see how business might effectively help to, despite the politics of the day, might effectively help to continue to create, let's say, an upward mobility for people of African descent here? What's your take?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. Look, I do believe that when you consider both the economic and social capacities, both individually and institutionally, of Black America, that there are a lot of the factors and conditions that account for the success or not of our community that in many ways do align economically, socioculturally, competitively with what we think about as emerging markets or developing countries. So I do see the parallels. But I also see more than most that notion of Black Americans being disrupted by what I refer to as this sort of paradox of inequality. And that is, look, if you look at the evolution of countries around the world, what we have seen quite clearly, I mean, the data are rather unambiguous here, is that the degree of inequality has lessened precipitously. We've seen this most visibly in parts of Latin America, in Brazil, especially in China and India. The irony, and here's the paradox, is that it is the inequality within countries that is increasingly exacerbated. And this is where Black communities or Native communities or other communities within a particular country are being most severely affected. This is what concerns me about our future. I worry less about sort of global intra-country equality than I do about the capacity of our community to effectively prepare ourselves for the disruptions and the profound changes that are the inevitable evolution of our economy over the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, because I was reading somewhere, for example, that the GDP is such a terrible measure of economic well-being, and it was not really set up for a service economy. It doesn't really measure those things well. Your school is one of the top 100 business schools or top 25 business schools, and you've been credited with doing several very game-changing things. And this is why I was so excited to talk to you. I mean, for example, you have a program in which your students are kind of given projects. Have you come across any students who have been interested in looking in this challenge of business as social enterprise and creating, you know, a different model around how business would measure itself?
Yeah, I would say that this is really part of not just the institutional DNA here at Daniels, but a great deal of the US-based business schools and management education activities are geared toward enabling students to provide the kind of support and impact and do the work that will enable institutions and individuals to reach their highest capacity. Look, our business students recognize that while the market is not a panacea, it is, in our view, an essential attribute in the development of communities. And one of the wonderful things about business and business schools today is that people come to us with notions of not just doing good for themselves in terms of economics. I mean, look, we still send people to Wall Street. We have a great finance program. We have lots of bankers and venture capitalists and all that. And that's as it should be. That's a part of business. But we also have a lot of individuals who want to leverage the considerable skills they have to go to communities and regions of the world and make a difference. And that, for me, anyway, is in part what makes this such a privilege to be in a position like this. So that is definitely a part of contemporary management education in the US.
So as you think then about the future of Black America and the future of inner city economics or rural Georgia, Clay County economics, what kind of business do you see in 2030 in those types of places? What might that look like?
So I think what we're seeing is quite clearly the disintermediation of the traditional marketplace, the digitization of how we interact with one another, where it used to be a challenge of scarcity, for example, not having access to capital, not having access to information. Now it is a challenge of abundance. All of us on our cell phones have unprecedented access to information. We can raise capital through distributed networks. Mm-hmm. I think very differently about that. I think the issue is that when you have an information-based economy, one has to recognize that the marketplace is going to, by definition, remain disrupted. So for African Americans and for any other segment of the community, the challenge is for our community to prepare ourselves for jobs and markets and opportunities that do not yet exist. And what does that mean in terms of skill acquisition? What does that mean in terms of our technological prowess? What does that mean in terms of how we think about communities? This is what those of us in business schools, and I think hopefully most thoughtful people in our community, are trying to wrestle with. And when you look at some of the dynamics, whether it's education, whether it's the political rhetoric, it's a little disconcerting. But I think there are huge opportunities.
Well, I mean, when you look at we're talking about like the fourth industrial revolution and infotech and cognitech and neurotech and biotech.
Right.
This
right?
whole idea that AI is going to be approaching the singularity in 2030 and all of this stuff. And so for me, going to the local CVS, for example, I tend to take the line with the person at the thing, just because I want to make sure that, you know, Boo keeps his job. So that's just a personal preference. I mean, that's because I've decided to make that choice. But the reality, as you said, is we're thinking about not the individual, let's say those of us who have made it across that invisible barrier, but the community that remains at, as I say, the bottom, that if we're trying to meet the UN agenda, we have to say we'd like to see them at least move from point A to point A plus 20. How do you see then, if let's say there are going to be more jobs, the trend is to more increase in jobs in healthcare, for example,
Right.
is there a way in which we can imagine business schools like yours right now preparing, maybe having like street business programs to prepare people in these communities to think critically about the future, the way maybe that the people who were part of the previous movement. So how is the economic movement, let's call it that, call it economics movement, what is the Garvey-esque movement of the 21st century?
Right. So I really appreciate that. I think that is a particularly important question, and one that we are wrestling with to this day. Among other things, it does mean that we have to, and when I say we, I mean businesses and universities and perhaps business schools in particular, have to have the capacity to selectively abandon our past orthodoxies and to recognize that this structural, programmatic, curricular, historical approach that has defined our industry for the last 100 years is no longer applicable.
Yeah.
And that's pretty easy to talk about, right? But it's not so easy to. I mean, you know, we talk about that kind of change. Everybody loves it in the abstract, and it's hard to disagree with. But when you try to operationalize it, prepare students for this new marketplace, it's different. So it means we have to stop thinking about 4-year degree certification at traditional colleges and universities the way we used to. And I'm somebody who has committed my life to higher education. It means we need to think about the agility, the flexibility, the credentialing mechanisms, the stackability, the platform by which we transfer the most salient skills to students. Look, here's what I believe. Every student needs post-secondary training and development after high school. But that need not, and in fact, it cannot be the pursuit of the, quote, typical US-based 4-year residential degree institution. And until institutions start offering scalable, transferable opportunities for students to train and be developed on their time frame, we're going to struggle with this. So this is where universities are today. We're thinking differently about this, whether it's online, whether it's MOOCs, whether it's blended, whether it's these partnerships. What we are seeing is a major inflection period of US higher education. That is as it ought to be. We also have businesses and business entities that are also thinking radically differently how they train and recruit and support employees. So I think we're getting there. There's just a lot of tradition that we have to separate ourselves from. And I think that's proving difficult.
But how does an organization like yours and somebody with your level of influence then help to transfer some of these ideas into, let's say, the head of the traditional Black leadership? And I'm not going to count you among the traditional Black leadership. By tradition, I'm talking about like the civil rights movements, the Black church. I mean, if you can do a partnership with a university in Afghanistan, right? Can we foresee, in order to get to a better 2030, a partnership between, you know, yourself and some place in Clay County, Georgia? I mean, literally.
So I think that's absolutely critical. And look, you probably know the demographics of Colorado. 6%, 6% of this population are of African American descent. The University of Denver is pretty selective, pretty expensive institution. It doesn't have a long history of engaging in those issues that you're talking about. But if you fast forward to today, there are at least two definitive partnerships that I think affirm the very best of what we're attempting to do. We work really closely with the Urban Leadership Foundation here at Metropolitan Denver, which is an organization comprised of professionals of color, Black professionals around Denver that have taken on responsibility to prepare and train the next generation of business leaders. So every year they bring 30 plus young Black professionals through a 12-month educational process. Mm-hmm. So we now partner with them. We're developing their curriculum. Mm-hmm. We're doing a lot of the teaching for them. We provide them office space in the Daniels College. Mm-hmm. We are partners in their strategic development. And what we have communicated to our faculty is that this notion of inclusivity and diversity, this is a market imperative for us. We have no alternative but to get in the harness and to support and enable these communities. That's been a sea change here. We're also very directly and substantively involved in creating and developing courses for the Black Chamber of Commerce in Denver. So you've got this really very majority, really traditional. We've been around a long time. We're like the 8th or 9th oldest business school in the country. We've got a lot of tradition and history. But now you see us actively and intentionally engaging meaningfully and reciprocally with these vital Black organizations around metropolitan Denver as a matter of course, because we believe it's not just the right thing to do, it is the essential thing to do if we're to remain competitive and viable. So I'm very pleased with that. I think those are great examples of what business schools are doing and what can't.
That's probably why you have made the list of best full-time MBAs, at least since 2016, which is good to know that you arrived and brought this, into the place. So, and that, by the way, folks, is a list that is compiled with talking to 15,000 alumni of this business school. So that's good to know that you're doing this kind of work. So then this is interesting because this experiment then, in terms of training leaders, is about training them to think, I guess, being able to think with agility that would be necessary to master whatever, because we know the jobs of 2025 are not yet even thought about because the technology is changing so fast.
Right.
So you're saying that you're now developing curriculum for the Black Chambers of Commerce. So I can very well imagine the opportunity and possibility of actually just replicating this curriculum once it's done and saying, hey, you guys can have it, come in here and do like 2 days.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very good. So like you said earlier, the SDGs 10 inequality talks both about internal inequality, which is what we're talking about today.
Right.
Do you think that despite the challenges now around the politics and the policies of Washington and tax breaks or not tax breaks, that you imagine that the business sector, in this case, let's talk about the small business sector. The small business sector in America will be able to, I guess, morph into whatever it needs to morph into to continue to be an opportunity for growth?
So that's a really interesting question. Look, I do think that the disruptive aspects of the marketplace, some of the policy environments, whether it's cost of healthcare or minimum wage, have an impact on the viability and competitiveness of our small business sector. Mm-hmm. With that said, to me, there is no alternative. It's not even close in terms of my recognition and belief in the power of the private sector to be the dominant driver in enabling our community to reach its highest and best aspirations. Businesses, by definition, pay attention to market forces and to market potential. You cannot separate market potential from the tens of billions of dollars in purchasing power that the Black community has. I am convinced that that remains the most important avenue for success and the opportunity for us to reach as we climb among our communities. The challenge is to break the cycles that have continued to result in generational poverty, to address issues of inequitable schooling and crime issues, and I believe, and I know this is difficult territory sometimes, and I believe some of the social cultural constructs that continue to be challenges for our communities. At the core of that, at the center, I believe the business community and small businesses represent an extraordinarily viable and essential opportunity for our community. And so I'm very optimistic about that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because as I hear you, I'm thinking again about this idea of the metrics. You measure what matters, right? And if we're measuring, if we're continuing to use measures that don't matter, like the GDP for most state and local governments, then it might be very good that some of the big companies that have signed on to some of these social compacts for the UN and are looking for help in defining the metrics and are open to being measured around people, planet issues, right? And prosperity issues, which is different from wealth, right? Maybe again, I mean, there is room for that sort of conversation and research to come out of what you're doing right now, because you're actually doing a living experiment, and more partnerships with other universities that are open to having this conversation, so you can really have this, in this case, Black Chamber of Commerce executive MBA program, wherever they are, you know, to sort of rapidly ramp up the ability, especially if you're living in a community where it's endemic, you know, this kind of problem is endemic. So as you think about the future technologies, right?
Right.
What would you say would be your biggest worry? Despite the fact that you are optimistic, what would be your biggest worry about the ability to actually create jobs?
The lack of exposure to youngsters in our community to the life-changing power of technology, combined with the pernicious misuse by some of that very technology to manipulate markets and data and information.
I shouldn't laugh, but I just finished looking at an article about, I'm from Jamaica, I just finished looking from an article about the scamming in Jamaica and the fact they have databases from Google and they're using Google Maps. I'm like, okay, this is like crimes and high crimes and things. So the question is, how do we, and one of the issues that comes up as I hear that is this idea of net neutrality, and the reason why many people like myself were concerned about this net neutrality issue. What if in fact the providers don't see the value of making internet speed accessible? Will we further be left behind because we can't access certain things?
It's a very important point. That was, as you point out, the basis of the argument from those detractors of net neutrality, of the bill to eliminate net neutrality. So look, it's too early to sort of speculate on, again, because what the supporters of the bill will say is this is part of the marketplace, and these businesses are never going to jeopardize their access to markets by playing favorite. It's too early to see. What we do know is that there are still far too many households without Ethernet or other connectivity, particularly in certain communities. And those kids are at a disadvantage in terms of their inability to have early access and exposure and to leverage the tools of technology. That is what I concern myself with. I mean, do I think that every student should be learning Python or to code in R? I don't know about that, but they ought to know what Python is. They ought to know what coding looks like. When we think about the on-ramp to the 21st century economy, this is part of it. Understanding and thinking critically about the implications of AI, knowing how to manipulate data, knowing what AI connectivity means. And as someone who was educated in Detroit public schools and was fortunate really to make it out, I know what a disadvantage those students are at. And that is what, as an educator, I try to think about.
I want to go for a completely different tack very quickly and ask you about, as I think about this idea of business and ownership, where do you see new models of ownership, cooperatives, employee share ownership programs going? Do you think that is going to be a rising trend? And in that sense, do you think, I'm going to ask a different question, what would be the unions doing? Because we're moving towards a gig economy and people not staying long in jobs. So what will be the unions doing in the next 10 years? Yeah,
so I would probably defer this to my my labor economist colleague. And so while I don't claim any prescient insight or data on this, let me just say this. So again, I'm from Detroit, big union town. UAW and teachers unions were a part of my upbringing. I believe that the future of the economy in this country and around the world is going to be one that is increasingly anathema to the traditional ideas and structures of unionization. If you were to, so this is a pretty contrarian point of view. I know that several decades ago, unions were absolutely essential. There were just violent and egregious issues that employers perpetrated against employees, and unions were essential. I'm not sure today, when you think about the price point divergence and competitive issues and disruptions, I'm not sure that the traditional view of unions is as essential to the competitiveness of firms that they ought to be. And if you look at data, if you look at the corporations and performance metrics, you can have your own point of view. Look, it is fundamentally about legacy versus agility.
Okay.
And unions are legacy institutions. And unless they can morph into the kind of structures to migrate to a 21st century economy, I think it's going to be trouble with them. One final data point on that. There is a reason that union membership, in my view, is at an all-time low. Not saying that's good or bad, just saying that is the reality, and that's something that we need to be aware of. So
you didn't talk about the new models of cooperative ownership or ESOPs. Where do you think that might turn up in the future? Is this a way for the Black community to borrow and get more wealth?
Yeah, so there are lots of interesting what I call new financial models of accessing capital that are going to be absolutely critical. And the ones that come to mind, of course, are the online platforms where you can raise money. But the ESOP piece, the giving of a stake in the enterprise, sharing the risk with employees, making sure that they recognize that they have a stake in not only the present, but in the future, is, I think, an increasingly viable option. But first and foremost, Dr. Nelson, we have to increase the level of interest in the part of our community to become entrepreneurs and business owners in the first place before we can think about structures and ownership mechanisms. And this notion goes to how we are educating our students and our young people, and we need to begin to stop focusing so much on educating them to get a job as to educating them to create a job. And that takes a certain amount of mindset and a certain approach. That's where my emphasis is.
So I'm going to ask you to end with a positive view of the future, because you already said you're optimistic, right?
Of course, yeah.
So
not naively so, but I think reasonably and appropriately so.
Good. I like to always end on an optimistic note. Otherwise, why do we do? As a teacher, professor, educator, you really ought to be optimistic, or we're in serious trouble. I want you to jump into 2030. I guess by then you would have retired from this August body and other things. But I want to see if maybe you can project for me a headline based on the success of this experiment you're doing right now with the Chambers of Commerce.
Yeah.
What would you like to say?
I would say that the headline would be something along the lines of the historical divergence in educational and income performance among different racial and ethnic groups is no longer definitive. I would suggest that our notions of race and ethnicity and the social constructs associated with that are no longer the defining sort of bit of rhetoric in our community. I would think that the access, the proliferation of information and data will, as the headline will say, be recognized as the great equalizer in 2030. That is, in part, at least, what I remain optimistic about.
Oh, thank you so much. And we'll have to leave it right there, folks. I want to thank you so much, Dean BRENT CHRITE, the 16th Dean of the Daniels College of Business in Denver, Colorado, for taking time to join us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, folks, we have again had a wonderful time to talk about the future history of Black America. We are so grateful to hear the wisdom and have the opportunity to just have some insights about how we might actively rethink the future and therefore shape the future we want. Remember that we are exploring salient ideas for sustainable future, knowing that the future is embedded in the landscape of today. So, seize the future. And until next time, safe journeys.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum Live online. This podcast aims to tell and share stories about the emerging future and help us better shape the future we want. The Futures Forum Live online is a production of the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Future Sense now. Remember, our future is embedded in the landscape of the present. Share this story and share the future.